one of the world's most dangerous borders, was never supposed to exist. Today, it's guarded by thousands of soldiers, lined with barbed wire, surrounded by landmines, and separates millions of people from the families they once called home. But this border wasn't born after centuries of hatred. It began as a temporary line on a map, a decision made in just a matter of hours by people who never imagined it would change millions of lives. That single line split one nation in two, tore families apart, sparked a devastating war, and transformed one united people into two countries that would grow into complete opposites. It was supposed to disappear. Instead, nearly 80 years later, it remains one of the most heavily fortified borders on Earth. So how did a temporary line become a permanent scar across an entire nation? Let's go back to the very beginning. Because to understand why Korea is divided today, we have to witness how it all began. This is the story of how Korea was divided, and why that division still shapes the world today. Before there was a North Korea, before there was a South Korea, there was simply Korea. For centuries, the Korean peninsula was one nation. Families traveled freely from the northern mountains to the southern coast. Markets bustled with merchants. Farmers worked the same fields their ancestors had cultivated for generations. Children grew up believing they belonged to one country. No border divided them. No checkpoints stood in their way. No one imagined that one day this land would become one of the most heavily guarded borders on Earth. But by the late 19th century, Korea had become one of the most valuable pieces of land in Asia. To China, it was a centuries-old sphere of influence. To Russia, it was a gateway to the Pacific. To Japan, it was the key to building a modern empire. Three powerful nations looked at the same peninsula, and each believed it could not afford to lose it. Unfortunately for Korea, it was the weakest of them all. The Joseon dynasty had ruled for more than 500 years, but by the late 1800s it was struggling. Corruption spread through the government. Political factions fought one another while foreign powers grew stronger with every passing year. Korea wasn't collapsing because its people lacked courage. It was being surrounded by empires far larger, richer, and militarily stronger than itself. Then, in 1894, the struggle for Korea exploded into war. China and Japan fought the First Sino-Japanese War, with Korea caught directly in the middle. Although the Korean people had little say in the conflict, it was their homeland that had become the prize. The outcome stunned the world. Japan defeated China in only a few months, ending centuries of Chinese dominance in East Asia. For Korea, victory brought no freedom. It simply replaced one powerful neighbor with another. Japan's influence spread rapidly across the peninsula. Then came the event that convinced many Koreans their country was slipping away. Before sunrise on October 8, 1895, Japanese-backed assassins forced their way into Gyeongbokgung Palace. The quiet halls erupted into chaos. Servants ran through smoke-filled corridors. Palace guards drew their swords, desperately trying to hold back the attackers. Room by room, the assassins searched for Queen Min, known today as Empress Myeongseong. When they found her, they murdered her inside her own palace. Her body was dragged outside and burned in an attempt to erase the crime. News of the assassination spread across the country like wildfire. If the queen could be murdered in the safest place in Korea, who was safe? American missionary and educator Homer Hulbert, who spent years in Korea and witnessed Japan's growing influence, later wrote, "Korea has been sacrificed." Those words captured what many Koreans already feared. Their future was no longer in their own hands. King Gojong believed he would be next. In early 1896, disguised and fearing for his life, he secretly escaped the palace and sought refuge inside the Russian legation in Seoul. Imagine the humiliation. The king of Korea could no longer safely sleep inside his own palace. The kingdom was still standing, but it was no longer in control of its own destiny. Only a few years later, another war broke out, this time between Japan and the Russian Empire. Once again, Korea became the battlefield on which larger powers fought for dominance. The Russo-Japanese War shocked the world. Against almost every prediction, Japan defeated one of Europe's greatest empires, with China defeated and Russia driven back. There was no major power left capable of stopping Japan. By 1910, Korea hadn't lost a war. It had lost its freedom. Japan formally annexed the peninsula, and for the first time in centuries, Korea disappeared from the map as an independent nation. 35 years of colonial rule had begun. As the years passed, Japanese control reached deeper into everyday life. Political freedoms vanished. Korean culture came under increasing pressure. Resistance was met with harsh punishment, yet the desire for independence never disappeared. On March 1st, 1919, that determination burst into the open. Across towns and cities, millions of Koreans gathered peacefully, carrying handwritten declarations of independence and waving Korean flags that had been hidden from the authorities. They came without armies, without weapons, only with hope. The response was brutal. Japanese police and soldiers opened fire on demonstrators, arrested thousands, and crushed the movement with overwhelming force. Yet something remarkable had happened, even in defeat. The world had seen that Korea had not surrendered its identity. One declaration read aloud that day proclaimed, "We hereby proclaim the independence of Korea and the liberty of the Korean people." Those words echoed far beyond the streets where they were first spoken. Years passed. Children were born who had never experienced life in a free Korea. An entire generation grew up under colonial rule, wondering if independence would ever return. Then, the world descended into the deadliest conflict in human history, the Second World War. As Japan expanded across Asia, millions suffered under the weight of war. Koreans were drawn into Japan's war effort through forced labor, military conscription, and widespread exploitation. Countless families were torn apart, and for many, survival became the only goal. But by 1945, Japan's empire was collapsing. The United States fought across the Pacific, capturing island after island. The Soviet Union launched a massive offensive against Japanese forces in Manchuria, overwhelming one of Japan's last major armies on the Asian mainland. Then came the final blow. In August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Days later, Japan surrendered. After 35 years, Korea was free. Church bells rang. People flooded into the streets. Korean flags hidden beneath floorboards, inside walls, and in secret compartments for decades were raised once again. Many cried, many embraced strangers. Many believed the nightmare was finally over. They believed Korea would once again become one nation. They were wrong, because while Koreans celebrated their freedom, powerful nations were already deciding the country's future, not in Seoul, not by the Korean people, but in rooms thousands of miles away, and within weeks, a single line drawn across a map would change Korea forever. For 35 years, Japan had controlled nearly every part of the country. When its empire collapsed, it took that government with it. Koreans didn't wait for someone else to rebuild their nation. Across towns and cities, local leaders formed committees to restore order. Schools reopened. Food was distributed. Volunteers patrolled the streets to keep the peace. On September 6, 1945, Korean leaders even proclaimed the People's Republic of Korea, hoping to establish a government for the entire peninsula. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Korea would finally stand on its own again. But events were moving faster than anyone realized. In August 1945, Soviet forces swept into northern Korea as they advanced against the collapsing Japanese empire. American leaders feared that if they delayed, the Soviet Union might occupy the entire peninsula. Time was running out. In Washington, two young American Army officers, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, were handed an unexpected task. find a way to divide the occupation zones. They had only hours. Spreading a National Geographic map across a table, they searched for a line that would place Seoul under American control while roughly splitting the peninsula in half. One officer pointed to the 38th parallel. The other agreed. That simple decision, made in just a few hours, would change millions of lives. No Korean official was in the room. No Korean citizen was asked for their opinion. The proposal was sent to Moscow. To the surprise of many American officials, the Soviet Union accepted it. Within weeks, Soviet troops entered the north. American forces landed in the south. At first, the line meant almost nothing. Families crossed it, merchants traveled through it, letters still reached loved ones on the other side. In those first weeks, families could still travel between Seoul and Pyongyang, believing the division would soon disappear. Everyone believed the division was temporary. Even the governments that created it expected Korea to reunite after a new national government was formed. But the world was changing. The guns of the Second World War had barely fallen silent. Yet another conflict was already taking shape: the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union had fought side by side against Japan. Now, they viewed each other with growing suspicion. Neither side was willing to risk the other gaining influence over Korea. Slowly, the temporary occupation became a political divide. The political divide became a military frontier, and a line that had been drawn in only a few hours began separating families who had lived together for generations. It was never supposed to become a border, but soon it would become one of the most heavily guarded borders on Earth. To most Koreans, the 38th parallel wasn't a border. It was simply a temporary military line that everyone believed would soon disappear. Families continued visiting relatives. Merchants crossed from north to south. Many believed reunification was only a matter of time. But as weeks became months, that hope slowly began to fade. In the north, the Soviet Union moved quickly to reshape Korean society. Large estates owned by wealthy landowners were confiscated and redistributed to poor farmers. Major industries were placed under state control. Political opponents were removed from power, while communist organizations rapidly expanded their influence. Amid these sweeping changes, one man was quietly rising to power. His name was Kim Il-sung, a former guerrilla fighter who had resisted Japanese occupation alongside communist forces. Kim had earned the trust of Soviet leaders. Backed by Moscow, he steadily became the most powerful figure in northern Korea. Meanwhile, a very different future was taking shape in the south. The United States military government oversaw the southern half of the peninsula. Instead of building a communist state, American authorities supported a government based on elections, private property, and a capitalist economy. Soon, another powerful leader emerged. His name was Syngman Rhee, a lifelong Korean nationalist who had spent decades in exile campaigning for his country's independence. Rhee finally returned home, believing he would help lead a free Korea. Like Kim Il-sung, he wanted Korea united, but under a completely different system. Both men dreamed of one Korea. Neither was willing to live under the other's vision. As relations between the United States and the Soviet Union grew colder, the future of Korea became increasingly uncertain. Negotiations continued, but agreement never came. Everything depended on holding one nationwide election that would allow all Koreans to choose a single government. It never happened. The Soviet Union refused to allow United Nations officials into northern Korea, making nationwide elections impossible. Instead, separate elections were held only in the south. On August 15, 1948, crowds gathered in Seoul as a new flag was raised over the capital. The Republic of Korea, known today as South Korea, was officially born. Syngman Rhee became its first president. Less than a month later, crowds gathered once again, this time in Pyongyang. On September 9, 1948, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, known today as North Korea, was officially established. Kim Il-sung became its leader. For the first time in history, there were now two Korean governments. Both claimed to be the only legitimate government of all Korea. To each side, the other government had no legal right to exist. Neither accepted the border. Neither believed the division would last forever. Both intended to reunify the peninsula. The only disagreement was who would rule it. For ordinary families, the uncertainty only grew. Parents still believed they would see children living across the 38th parallel again. Brothers kept writing letters. Sisters waited for visits that never came. Few imagined that the temporary line separating them would soon become impossible to cross. Neither government wanted two Koreas. Both wanted one. The only question left was who would control it. The answer would come in war. The temporary border had failed. For nearly 5 years, both North and South Korea claimed to be the rightful government of the entire peninsula. Neither accepted the division. Both promised to reunite Korea. The only question was, who would do it first? Before dawn on June 25, 1950, the answer came. Thousands of North Korean soldiers stormed across the 38th parallel. Behind them, hundreds of Soviet-built tanks rumbled south, crushing barricades and defenses as artillery lit up the morning sky. Within minutes, the quiet border had become a battlefield. For millions of South Koreans, the invasion came without warning. Families woke to the sound of explosions. Children were pulled from their beds. Telephone lines went dead. Roads filled with frightened civilians carrying only what they could hold in their arms. The war had begun. South Korean forces fought desperately, but they were outnumbered and poorly equipped. Against the overwhelming assault, they struggled to slow the North Korean advance. City after city fell. Then, only 3 days after the invasion, Seoul fell. Smoke rose above the capital. Government officials fled south as desperate civilians crowded the streets searching for missing family members. Bridges were destroyed behind the retreating army, leaving thousands stranded on the wrong side of the Han River. Many believed South Korea would cease to exist within days, but the war was no longer Korea's alone. The United Nations condemned the invasion and called on its member nations to defend South Korea. The United States responded immediately. Soon, soldiers from 16 countries were fighting under the United Nations command, transforming a civil conflict into an international war. Even so, the situation became even more desperate. By August 1950, United Nations and South Korean forces had been pushed into a small defensive pocket around the port city of Busan. Behind them, the sea. Ahead of them, the North Korean army. There was nowhere left to retreat. If Busan fell, South Korea would almost certainly disappear. Then came one of the boldest military operations in modern history. General Douglas MacArthur proposed a surprise landing far behind enemy lines at the port of Incheon. Many military commanders believed the plan was far too dangerous. Powerful tides, narrow waterways, and high seawalls made success seem almost impossible. But on September 15, 1950, the gamble paid off. United Nations forces landed at Incheon, catching the North Korean army completely by surprise. Within days, Seoul was recaptured. North Korean forces retreated north at remarkable speed. For a brief moment, it seemed the war was almost over. It wasn't. As United Nations forces pushed toward the Yalu River near the Chinese border, China repeatedly warned that it would intervene if foreign troops continued advancing. The warnings were ignored. Then, in late October, reports began arriving from the mountains. Something was moving. Under the cover of darkness, hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers quietly crossed the Yalu River. When they attacked, The offensive stunned United Nations forces. Entire units were forced into chaotic retreats through snow-covered mountains as freezing winds swept across the peninsula. For many soldiers, the cold became as deadly as the fighting itself. Once again, the war had changed. For the next 3 years, the front lines surged north and south across Korea. Towns were reduced to rubble. Entire villages disappeared. Millions of civilians fled their homes, never knowing whether they would return. One Korean refugee later remembered, "We locked the front door because we believed we'd be back in a few days." They never returned. By the time the fighting settled into a stalemate, the war had already claimed millions of military and civilian lives. For a terrifying moment, the conflict also threatened to draw the world's greatest powers into an even larger war. American, Chinese, and Soviet interests had all collided on the Korean Peninsula, making the conflict one of the most dangerous confrontations of the Cold War. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice agreement was signed. The guns largely fell silent. But the agreement was not a peace treaty. Technically, the Korean War never officially ended. The border remained almost exactly where it had been before the invasion. But everything else had changed. Millions were dead. Millions more had lost their homes. Families who had once expected to reunite in weeks now realized they might never see one another again. The guns fell silent. The border remained. And over time, that temporary military line became one of the most heavily fortified borders on Earth. From that moment forward, North Korea and South Korea would begin living two completely different histories. When the fighting finally stopped, North Korea and South Korea looked almost identical. Both had ruined cities, both had starving families, both had lost millions of people. No one could have imagined how different their futures would become. At first, North Korea appeared to recover faster. Backed by the Soviet Union and China, it rebuilt factories, restored industries, and for a time, its economy outpaced the South. Meanwhile, South Korea struggled through years of poverty and political instability. In the 1950s, it was one of the poorest countries in the world. Then, everything changed. Beginning in the 1960s, South Korea transformed itself through rapid industrialization and economic growth. New highways, factories, and ports reshaped the country. Companies like Samsung, Hyundai, and LG became global brands, helping turn South Korea into one of the world's largest economies. North Korea chose a different path. Kim Il-sung built a highly centralized state around his rule. As the decades passed, the country became increasingly isolated, while power remained within the Kim family. While South Korea built skyscrapers, exported technology, and became known around the world for its economy and culture, North Korea became known for its military, strict government control, and growing nuclear weapons program. Although the two countries shared the same language, history, and culture, they had become two completely different worlds. Yet one thing never changed: the border. The Korean War ended with an armistice, not a peace treaty. Technically, the war has never officially ended. Today, the Korean demilitarized zone stretches across the peninsula, lined with fences, guard towers, landmines, and soldiers who still watch each other across the same line, drawn in 1945. For millions of families, the division never truly ended. Some parents grew old without ever seeing their children again. Some brothers and sisters spent entire lifetimes separated by a border they never chose. Years later, a small number of elderly family members were finally allowed to reunite. Many met for only a few hours before saying goodbye once again. More than 70 years have passed. The border that was meant to last only a short time still stands today. The people on both sides still share the same ancestors, they still speak the same language, but they now live in two completely different worlds. A temporary line became permanent, and that is how one nation became two completely different countries.